Medurstand, Understanding Medicine.
I am Professor Azizur Rahman and I'm founder of Medurstand-Understanding Medicine. Today I'm going to start a series of lectures on diabetes, and today's lecture will be on the basics, the glucose homeostasis and the role of insulin and glucagon, and the definition of diabetes, basic pathogenesis, and the classification and diagnosis. And I will have series of lecture which will cover the diet, the role of diet and role of exercise, medication, insulin, other injectable therapies, diabetic complication detail. Since diabetes is an extremely important topic, so we will have about 6 or 7 lectures on diabetes. So today I'm going to talk about the very basics. Now, glucose homeostasis, we have glucose in the blood all the time in a reasonable range. It's not a very narrow range like many other conditions, like many other substances. Like as I mentioned in my other lecture, calcium is maintained in a very narrow range. Glucose varies in a wide range, and depending upon whether we are in a fed state when we have eaten, that means we are in anabolic state, and this time main hormone which is in action is insulin. And when we are in the fasting state, for example, we have not eaten say for 10 hours, then the glucose is not coming from the gut, and in this situation glucagon is making glucose within the body from other substrates. So insulin and glucagon are the two main hormones which regulate our glucose, and they work in harmony. Now let's take the fed state, the anabolic state, and glucose is absorbed from the gut. Whatever food we take, there are at least 50% carbohydrates in it, and carbohydrates is converted into glucose and glucose is absorbed. And in this situation, since glucose is coming to the blood and insulin's main job is to lower glucose, so insulin gets stimulated, and there is a very complex mechanism how this insulin is stimulated. We will have a separate lecture on that also. So insulin is stimulated, and at that time in a normal person, glucagon is suppressed because gluconeogenesis is not needed. Both hormones, they work in harmony. Insulin is stimulated. Insulin comes from the beta cells of the pancreas. They get activated, and glucagon, which comes from the alpha cells of the pancreas, they get suppressed temporarily. Now, the basic function of insulin is to prevent glucose from rising. So this is the main role. Otherwise, glucose would go very high if there was no insulin in the body, which would keep it from rising. And how does it do that? First of all, we need glucose for energy production. So in the fed state also, we may be doing some physical work and we have to run our basal metabolism. So energy is consumed. The glucose is consumed to produce energy, and then extra glucose is stored in the form of glycogen, and then further glucose is converted into fats for long-term storage. So since we are consuming carbohydrates, it is used to produce energy, and extra glucose is converted into glycogen, which is a ready-made and immediate source of glucose in the fasting state, and then fats is a long-term storage. In the fasting state, which is basically a catabolic state, when our stored fats and other tissues are producing energy. So glucose is not coming from the gut because we are in the fasting state, and insulin is suppressed and glucagon is stimulated, just the opposite of fed state. Now, the basic purpose of glucagon is the glucose kept from falling. Okay, so insulin keeps glucose from rising, and glucagon prevent glucose from falling. And how does it do that? It, number one, glycogen is broken down into glucose, and that provides glucose. And then fats in the second step, if we run out of glycogen store, then the fat is converted into glucose, and amino acids, the proteins, are also converted in the same sequence. Proteins are the last tissues which are burnt to make glucose. And by the time there is a turn for protein to be burned, there is actually time for the next meal. So in the fasting state, it is the gluconeogenesis. First of all, glycogen, which is converted into glucose, and then fats and fatty acids and amino acids. They are converted into glucose. This process is called gluconeogenesis, and this is carried out by glucagon in the liver. Now, glucose homeostasis, because of this very efficient functioning of insulin and glucagon, glucose is kept in a reasonably narrow range. In the fasting state, for example, 70, in some situation it could go below 70 also, but 70 is generally considered to be lower normal range, and 100, according to the new guidelines, in the fasting state, our glucose should stay within 70 and 100 milligram of deciliter. In the fed state, when we've eaten, depending upon what we have eaten and how much we have eaten, and actually what were the carbohydrate contents of that food. So glucose would rise, and it may go as high as 140, in some cases little above 140, but in a mixed meal, in a healthy person who has healthy pancreas, even after eating, blood glucose should not go beyond 140. So this is how insulin and glucagon, they keep our glucose within a certain range, and the range is different for fasting and it is different for fed state. Now, when there is a problem with beta cells or insulin or glucagon or some other tissues, then this homeostasis fails and diabetes develops. What is diabetes? It's a complex metabolic derangement. I use the word complex because it's not just dysglycemia or hyperglycemia. There are many other components of this disease which we will be discussing in different lectures. It's a complex metabolic derangement characterized by hyperglycemia due to insufficient insulin effect. So that means either insulin is not sufficient in quantity, which is typically the feature of type 1 diabetes, or insulin may be there, but it is not working because of the receptor problem, because of the insulin resistance, which is seen in type 2 diabetes. In type 2 diabetes also later there is insulin insufficiency. Insulin is not sufficient in quantity. Classification, all types of diabetes, they have one thing in common, that is hyperglycemia. So the very definition of diabetes is related to glucose. So glucose remains the core component of the definition, and it is also the main goal of the treatment. So all criteria, all the criteria for the diagnosis and the goals are set based on either glucose or a surrogate marker of glucose called hemoglobin A1C. So there are various types. Any condition where there is hyperglycemia would be called a diabetes mellitus. There is actually a long list, but I am going to present a relatively short, emphasizing only on those important conditions which are important for undergraduates and postgraduate students. First of all, type 1 diabetes. It had different names previously: juvenile onset diabetes, insulin dependent diabetes, and autoimmune or critical insulin deficiency type of diabetes. but these days we call it type 1. Now, what is type 1 diabetes? It is the type of diabetes which typically develops in young age, but not always. It is dependent on insulin in the sense that if insulin is not provided, there is a possibility of serious complication, metabolic complication, and risk of diabetic ketoacidosis. And this is mostly autoimmune. Some types of type 1 diabetes are also not autoimmune, but majority, like 85% of type 1 diabetes is autoimmune. And I will give you some more details. And insulin is critically deficient or completely absent. So this is seen in 5 to 10% of the total population, total diabetics. Sorry. So, for example, if you take 100 patients and only 5 to 10 would have type 1, but it is mentioned first of all because of the nomenclature. Then we have the common type of diabetes. In 85% diabetics, it would be type 2 diabetes, and it is typically adult onset. These days, it is developing at a younger and younger age, but typically around 40. And insulin independent, it's not insulin dependent. Now, by that I do not mean that they will never need insulin, but at least at the time of diagnosis, it is possible to control their glycemia by dietary changes or by simple oral medication. They do not necessarily need insulin to control their glycemia, and they will certainly not develop diabetic ketoacidosis if insulin is not offered. So in that sense, they are not insulin dependent, but please note down, since they are much more commoner than type 1, ultimately most of the patients who are actually using insulin, they will belong to type 2. And the etiology is not exactly understood, but it is multifactorial, like sedentary lifestyle, like genetic uh, background, like weight, and like other things. So it is multifactorial, but not exactly one particular pathological mechanism. And there is initially insulin resistance. It is believed that type 2 diabetes starts with insulin resistance and then go on to develop insulin deficiency also. Once we have full-fledged type 2 diabetes, characterized by fasting as well as postprandial hyperglycemia, and I think typically we have both insulin resistance and insulin deficiency by that time. Then some special subtypes: maturity onset diabetes of young, abbreviated as MODY. Now this is, I think you can imagine that this is actually the type 2 diabetes which occurs in young. Alright, so maturity onset diabetes of young means it is the type 2 diabetes but occurring in young. That means since by nature it is type 2, initially it would respond to oral agents like type 2, but it occurs in young. Okay, so that is MODY. And then another type is called latent autoimmune disease of adults, abbreviated as LADA. This is just the opposite. This is autoimmune disease. So by nature it is type 1, but it is diagnosed in adults. So the concept is that there is autoimmune process, but perhaps it was a little weak autoimmune response, and it took several decades before patient developed diabetes. And in this patient, initially patient would respond to oral because they have some beta cells working, but very rapidly they would require insulin because by nature they are type 1, and very rapidly all the beta cells will be destroyed. Then there is a special type called gestational diabetes. Now, it is the type of diabetes which is first time diagnosed during pregnancy, typically in second or third trimester. Now, after the pregnancy is over, a majority will become euglycemic. Some will remain diabetic, But others who become euglycemic, they are also at the risk of developing diabetes later. At least 50% of them, they will develop diabetes later, or they will develop gestational diabetes in the subsequent pregnancy. So it is also a type of diabetes, but it has got a separate name. Pathogenesis of type 1 diabetes. Uh, First of all, there is some unknown trigger which activates T cells against our beta cell. The person is somewhat genetically predisposed, but type 1 diabetes is mostly acquired process, although we do not know the exact mechanism. Now, it is theorized that there is some infection, maybe with some virus, and our immunity is activated against that virus, and antibodies are made, T cells are activated against that virus primarily. But because of similarity between antigens on the beta cell and those antigens on that virus or whatever, so because of molecular mimicry, because of the similarity of antigens, those antibodies or those activated T cells which were meant to act against that invading organism, they cross react with our beta cells. Now, beta cells is the only source of insulin in our body. So if beta cells are destroyed, then of course there will be a deficiency of insulin. Now, this process is called insulitis. We of course do not do biopsies on these patients, but if somebody after developing type 1 diabetes dies for some reason, some road traffic accident or something else, and if you do autopsy, you will see T cell infiltration in their pancreas. So that is the indication that this is autoimmune in nature. We don't see this in type 2 diabetes. And if you do their antibodies and you estimate their antibodies from the person, and this has to be done at the time of diagnosis, you take their blood and do these antibodies, anti-islet cell antibodies, anti-insulin antibodies, anti-GAD antibodies, and these are present in their blood. It is believed that these antibodies, they just serve as a sign of autoimmunity. Actual cause of damage is T cells which are infiltrated into the pancreas. Now, at the time of diagnosis, almost complete destruction of beta cell is there. So there are almost very few, maybe few percent, 1, 2, 3% beta cells functioning. Others are all damaged. Now, since autoimmunity is very selective, it destroys only beta cell. It does not affect any other cells. The alpha cells are spared, progressive beta cell loss, severe insulin deficiency, and alpha cells are preserved. So I hope I was able to give you some idea about the pathogenesis of type 1. This is type 1, not type 2, and this would apply to only 5%, 5 to 10% typical type 1 diabetes. Unknown trigger activates T cells which destroy our beta cells progressively, resulting in critical insulin deficiency. So the patient would typically present with frank hyperglycemia, and frank hyperglycemia would result in polyuria, polydipsia, weight loss, and sometimes diabetic ketoacidosis. Let's take the example of type 2 diabetes. Now, type 2 diabetes is much more commoner than type 1, and there is very strong genetic factor. But there is not one gene that we know. There are multiple genes which are collectively responsible for causing diabetes. And these patients are also prone to develop diabetes. They have insulin resistance. It is unclear if they acquire, if the insulin resistance is primary, that leads to obesity. That is possible because, or the obesity is first thing because of overfeeding and physical inactivity. They develop obesity, and as a result of obesity, they develop insulin resistance. We do not know, but these are the factors which are responsible for the causation of type 2 diabetes. Initially, there is insulin resistance, but insulin resistance is always relative. It is not that insulin doesn't work at all. It's just that for a given level of glucose, you need more and more insulin to keep it normal. So there would be compensatory hyperinsulinemia. For a long time, glucose is normal. So there is compensatory hyperinsulinemia, but euglycemia. If you just test their sugar in the fasting state, it will be normal. But only if you challenge their body with glucose loading in the form of oral glucose tolerance test, only then it will show that their glucose control is not ideal. So for maybe about 5 years, 10 years, we remain in this stage. There is euglycemia, but there is at the expense of hyperinsulinemia. And we know that some of the complications of type 2 diabetes may be actually linked to hyperinsulinemia, like premature atherosclerosis. There is progressive beta cell loss and insulin deficiency, and then there is frank hyperglycemia. At this stage, you will have only postprandial hyperglycemia or hyperglycemia when challenged with oral glucose tolerance test. Fasting glucose may be normal, but later on, when insulin deficiency is superimposed on insulin resistance, then there will be frank hyperglycemia, both fasting as well as postprandial. So this was pathogenesis of type 2 diabetes, different mechanisms, but ultimately both end in hyperglycemia, which is the core component of type 2 diabetes, with diabetes. Now, in type 2 diabetes, I will further explain how these multiple factors cause hyperglycemia. Now, there are various organs affected. Of course, the most important is the pancreas. So we have already discussed that in pancreas there is progressive beta cell loss, so insulin production is reduced and insulin level is reduced. And glucagon is actually increased. This is like double trouble. There is excess of glucagon. In a fed state, if you remember my earlier slide, in the fed state, we do not need glucagon because glucose is coming from the gut. But in type 2 diabetes, glucagon is in excess even in the fed state and is producing insulin, producing glucose. So glucagon is there in the fed state when it was not needed, and it is producing glucose when it was not required to do that. So this is the abnormality. So double pathology here. Reduced production of insulin. Insulin was needed. It is not being produced, and glucagon is produced when it was not needed. Insulin and glucagon both are abnormal and they relate to pancreas. Then another problem in type 2 diabetes is that the glucose which is present in the blood is not being taken up by the muscles. So peripheral glucose utilization is reduced, and this is because of the insulin resistance. You know, glucose cannot enter cells without insulin. So if insulin is not in sufficient quantity, glucose will not enter the cells and it will stay in the plasma, causing hyperglycemia. Then there is extremely important role of liver. Liver needs to produce glucose only in the fasting state with the help of glucagon. But in this patient, in diabetic patient, since glucagon is high and is high also in the fed state, and in the fed state it is producing glucose from the liver, and this is called hepatic glucose production that is increased. So at least three factors we know responsible for hyperglycemia: pancreas, muscles, and the liver. But lately, we have identified that the fat in our body, especially the fat in the viscera, that is not only the energy store, it is actually metabolically active. Now, this visceral fat produces many adipokines, and these adipokines have various action. They could inhibit further uptake of glucose by the muscles. So the problem is aggravated, this visceral fat. And then they would also have what we call lipotoxicity on the pancreas. They would further reduce insulin production by the beta cells. And fat cells, these fat cells, the adipokines, they also further increase glucose production. So visceral fat is actually metabolically active, and this is manifested as truncal obesity or increased waist circumference, which is so very common in type 2 diabetic patients. So this is actually a major culprit which increases all existing pathologies. The fat in the subcutaneous tissue is just the storage of energy and may not be actually responsible for type 2 diabetes. Then very lately we found some very interesting things about intestine. Of course, intestine has role because glucose comes from the intestine, but it has got multiple roles. Whenever we eat, and that is sensed by our brain, and that leads to production of something called incretin. Now, these incretins are actually hormones which are produced by some specific cell in the intestine, and these incretins, they have effect on the beta cells and they have effect on the alpha cell, and this effect is glucose dependent. In other words, these incretins help insulin and they also help to reduce glucagon. So they stimulate production of insulin, which is glucose dependent. By that I means only when there is hyperglycemia, they will stimulate beta cells, and they will also suppress alpha cell not to produce glucagon, and again this is glucose dependent action. That means once glucose is normalized, then this function will cease. So this is very interesting, and not only that, these incretins, they have effect on our gastric emptying. They slow down gastric emptying so that too much carbohydrate is not presented to the intestine for absorption. So that would also keep the glucose in the normal range, and they also send signal to our brain, and that they also stimulate satiety, that tells our brain that we have eaten enough and stop further eating. There is some evidence that these incretins may also be helpful to keep our beta cells alive. And we know now that in type 2 diabetes, incretin effect is reduced and incretin level is reduced. So this is another. So you can understand that the pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes is much more complex and still incomplete. There is perhaps some role of brain also. So ultimately everything is controlled by brain. Uh, very complex but easy to understand. Main role is that of pancreas, but peripheral utilization by muscle, visceral fat and liver and incretin, they all play role in the pathogenesis of hyperglycemia. Now this is important because this relates to many drugs. Some drugs work on the incretin, some works on the liver, some work on the visceral fat, some works on the muscle, and some of course work on the alpha cells or beta cells. So we need to understand this slide before we can understand the mechanism of action of all those drugs, which will be presented in some subsequent lecture. Now, symptoms of diabetes in type 1 diabetes, since there is frank hyperglycemia, and frank hyperglycemia is likely to cause symptoms. There will be glycosuria, and that would result in polyuria, and polyuria will stimulate polydipsia because of dehydration. And since 60% of our body weight is water, because of the dehydration there will be significant weight loss, and also because we are losing calories, patient will actually lose body mass. And if not diagnosed and if not treated with insulin, these patients, they develop diabetic ketoacidosis. I have a separate lecture on diabetic ketoacidosis, so I think after this you should watch that video also. If diagnosis is not made, these patients will rapidly progress to DKA. Now, many patients, they would actually present with DKA. Now, this is the lesson for the youngsters. If you receive a young person in an unexplained coma, you must consider type 1 diabetes in the differential diagnosis. And it is very easy diagnosis. All you have to do is to check their sugar, and if sugar is very high, the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes is made. Now, type 2 diabetes, there is modest hyperglycemia. Initially, there is only transient postprandial hyperglycemia, and later on, there is hyperglycemia, but not to the extent as we see in type 1 diabetes. So, this modest hyperglycemia may not cause any symptoms at all. So, many times, type 2 diabetes is just an incidental finding. Somebody goes for detailed test and is surprised to see that he is a diabetic. Somebody undergoes an investigation before some operation. Somebody undergoes an investigation before an employment, or somebody has some illness and that illness is investigated and that diabetes glucose was included in the investigation and he is diagnosed diabetic. Sometimes patient comes with some complication, like patient has typical diabetic infection in the form of carbuncle or eye disease or kidney disease, then diagnosis is made. So diagnosis of type 2 diabetes is typically delayed. Sometimes you may have been diabetic for 10 years before the diagnosis is made. And symptoms are typically subtle. Patient would recall that lately there has been some problem. I did not have that much energy, or I've been having little more urine passage, something like that. But the symptoms are not as dramatic as in type 1. It is just not possible to miss type 1 diabetes. Patient with type 1 diabetes is so much symptomatic. He will have to do something. He will consult somebody and diagnosis will be made. Type 2 diabetes does not cause any symptoms at least for a long time and is likely to be missed. And symptoms, if present, are very subtle. So if this patient, majority are type 2 diabetic patient, if this patient does not have any symptoms, so patient is not bothered, he doesn't even know that he has a medical issue, so why to treat? Now this question will be taken up again, but here I just want to say one thing. Type 2 diabetes, if not treated, is notorious to cause many complications. It does not spare any organ of the body. So patient will develop many complications and then there isn't much that we will be able to do. So aim of treatment is to prevent those complications. Signs of diabetes, none I think very specific, although there are several things which might suggest just the fact that somebody is overweight, somebody has visceral obesity, somebody has little pigmentation on the neck called acanthosis nigricans, somebody has skin tags, somebody has some repeated recurrent infections, and somebody has some weight loss. We may suspect, and if we do the test and there's a strong family history, we may turn out to be correct, but actually there isn't any specific symptom of type 2 diabetes. No specific signs also. Diagnosis is very important. Diabetes can be suspected, but a formal diagnosis is not possible without investigation. And it's a very basic test. So I'm going to go through these current cut points. Now, if you take blood sugar fasting, and when we talk about fasting sugar in the context of diabetes, it is just 8 hours overnight fasting. 8 to sometimes 12 hours overnight fasting, and you do blood sugar test. In a normal person, it is expected to be less than 100. Even 100 is not exactly normal. So 99 or less, especially if you are young. And if blood sugar is 126 milligram per deciliter or higher, especially on multiple occasions, it is diabetes. Ideally, these should be measured with the laboratory, not with glucometer, because glucometers, they have 10%, they can overestimate or underestimate your sugar by 10%. So I think not that glucometer is not useful. If you do sugar on glucometer and if it is borderline, then you can have the laboratory test. But these values actually they refer to the actual laboratory test, and especially if more than once. So less than 100 is normal, more than 126 is abnormal. This is normal, this is diabetes. In between value is called pre-diabetes. Pre-diabetes is actually diabetes in the making. So unless something is done, it would progress to diabetes. So I think some action needs to be taken at the level of pre-diabetes also. Then blood sugar 2 hours postprandial. Now this is not as reliable as fasting sugar because it would depend on the exact size of the meal and the composition of the meal. And if you do 2 hours after starting the meal, in a normal healthy person with average meal, the sugar should not exceed 140. 2 hours after the meal. But if it is 200 or more, plus there was some symptom to suspect diabetes, then diagnosis is made. Same would apply on oral glucose tolerance test, which we do not do very often these days because of the availability of hemoglobin A1C. It is still done in some specific situations like pregnancy, but in adults, otherwise we do not do oral glucose tolerance test. So if your 2 hours postprandial sugar is above 140 but less than 200, you are in the pre-diabetes range. That would go on to develop diabetes. So something needs to be done. Medication can be considered, but lifestyle changes must be started. And then hemoglobin A1C in percentage, it is now measured in millimoles per moles, but traditional is this percentage. So I'm giving you the percentage value. It should be less than 5.7. Even 5.7 is not right. So less than 5%. It doesn't really depend whether the sample was taken in the fasting state or the postprandial state or at night or whatever time. It would give you the same value because it is the average of 3 months. By the way, I have one complete lecture on interpretation of hemoglobin A1C. If you're interested to know more about hemoglobin A1C, you can watch that video, which is like just one interpretation of hemoglobin A1C. And I have given various scenarios, and I think that will help you to understand the true value of hemoglobin A1C. And if it is 6.5 or above, this is diabetes. In between is pre-diabetes. So if all are concordant, like fasting is more than 126, postprandial more than 200, and HbA1c is more than 6.5, then there is no controversy, then diabetes is there. But if there is discordance, like one is in the range of diabetes, the other is in the range of pre-diabetes, then typically either the worst report, the one which is indicating diabetes, is believed and action is started, or that is repeated. Depending upon patient's expectation, the test may be repeated or the worst value may be believed and action may be taken. So this is the classification, the diagnosis of diabetes. The same criteria are applicable for type 1, type 2, MODY and LADA. But the criteria for gestational diabetes is different. I would have a separate lecture on gestational diabetes. Effect of good glycemic control. Uh, Actually, prevention of complication is our aim. And the metabolic complications, we have 3 types of complication diabetes. I will show you all those types. We have metabolic complications which are preventable with proper diagnosis, proper treatment. Metabolic complications are preventable, and if they develop, they are treatable. And then we have microvascular complication. These are, I would say, mostly preventable. with good glucose control, they're mostly preventable. By the way, let me say one thing: no matter what you do, no matter how much resources you have, no matter how much, whichever drug you're using, insulin, insulin pump, oral medication, it is just not possible to restore glycemia. It is once you develop diabetes because of the risk of hypoglycemia. It is possible to go into remission if you are newly diagnosed diabetic, but that does not mean that you are normal. That means your HbA1c remains below 6.5. So our aim is to control glucose as close to normal as possible. Currently available means do not allow to make a diabetic patient a non-diabetic patient. So that is why microvascular complication will still develop, but if the glycemic control is good, then mostly they will be prevented or at least delayed. Then there's a big chunk of macrovascular complication. This is actually what kills most of the people, and very unfortunately, even good glycemic control does not give guarantee that these complications will not be there, because there are many factors other than hyperglycemia, and we will discuss them in next slides. And one of the next slides, there are several factors which contribute in the causation of these macrovascular complications. Now, little detail, what are the metabolic complications? For you, it is easy to remember only three: diabetic ketoacidosis. There is acidosis, there is ketosis, and this is an emergency. Then hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state. Now, previously it used to be called non-ketotic coma, because most of these patients are not actually in coma. So new nomenclature is hyperglycemic hyperosmolar state. This is metabolic complication. And third is lactic acidosis. And some people would include hypoglycemia also in the metabolic complication, but hypoglycemia is actually the complication of the treatment, not the complication of the disease itself. So I have not included it here. Just remember three metabolic complications if diabetes. These are more common in type 1. Metabolic complications are more common in type 1, but they can occur in type 2 also. Then we have microvascular complication. As the name says, it is because of the damage to the small vessels, the capillaries, and they can affect many organs. But three important ones are nephropathy, and that means that glomeruli are damaged very slowly, progressively. It passes through various stages: incipient nephropathy, then frank nephropathy. There are then stages CKD 1, 2, 3. Ultimately, patient may develop complete renal failure. Retinopathy. Retinopathy means there is involvement of the vessel in the retina. Again, it can be very easily diagnosed by doing fundoscopic examination. There are various abnormalities, like there are some hemorrhages, some exudates, and this indicates retinal involvement. And third one is neuropathy. Very common and very, very distressing. These patients with neuropathy, they have intolerable leg pain, especially at night, or tingling sensations, very annoying, and this is very common. Many times there are no signs, but patient has this symptom. So to make it easy, only three microvascular complications. I mentioned three metabolic complication and three microvascular complication. Then we have macrovascular complication. Macrovascular complication, they occurred through the involvement of the large vessels and ischemic heart disease. Of course, heart is very, very important, and ischemic heart disease is very common in diabetic patient because of the involvement of the coronaries in atherosclerotic process. There is various forms of ischemic heart disease. Then we have cerebrovascular accidents. Same phenomenon is going in the carotid vessels and the vertebral vessels. They may also get clogged up, and that result in cerebrovascular accident. Then sometime peripheral arteries are involved, and one may develop gangrenes, and that might result in amputation. So three macrovascular complications. Macrovascular complications are most important because they are responsible for premature death and sudden death in about 80% of type 2 diabetic patients. What is the cause of complication? Very briefly, there are two factors. One is hyperglycemia, and hyperglycemia depends on how severe and how prolonged. That will translate into high HbA1c and high glucose values. So depending upon the degree and the duration of hyperglycemia, there will be production of glycation. Glycation is actually attachment of glucose with various proteins of the body. Famous is this HbA1c, which also helps to make a diagnosis. But actually, glycation of any body protein can occur. Like glycation of lipoprotein is believed to be responsible for premature atherosclerosis. So glycation, and then there is, and this may be partially reversible. This is completely reversible. Glycation process is also partially reversible because this is non-enzymatic, but it is actually permanent glucose attachment, so it is only partially reversible. But once we go to the last stage, advanced glycated end products, these are irreversible. This is like uh, the bad effect of glucose is now irreversible. So mechanism number one is hyperglycemia passing through various stages results in advanced glycated end products which are responsible for some of the macrovascular complications. The second is second factor is I mentioned that even good control of glucose does not guarantee that patient with type 2 diabetes will not develop complication. This is because of these coexisting or associated abnormalities. Now, hypertension may be there as a separate entity or may be caused by diabetes. Hypertension can cause diabetes, diabetes can cause hypertension. Both can coexist because of the common background phenotype and genotype. And hypertension contributes to macrovascular complication. Dyslipidemia, which is so very common in type 2 diabetic patient, that contributes to type 2 diabetes related macrovascular complication. Visceral obesity, I already explained. Then smoking, of course, it is a separate thing, but many people they smoke, they would add to diabetic complication. Then coagulopathy and also abnormality related to the platelet aggregation, also the abnormality related to the endothelial cells, and also plasminogen activator inhibitor. So multiple complex abnormalities, they add to macrovascular complication and some genetic factors. We know that the same degree of hypertension and dyslipidemia in two different people may have different set of complications. The one with genetic factor may be more prone to develop these complications. Now, there's nothing to be disheartened. All these conditions are also manageable. So the emphasis is that whenever you're treating type 2 diabetic patient, you will primarily focus on glucose, but you will also focus on these conditions if you want to really prevent macrovascular complication. That of course we won't, so we will address all these factors when we treat type 2 diabetes patient. The natural history of type 1 diabetes, early diagnosis is possible because the patient is symptomatic, and if treatment is not offered, it will lead to metabolic complication on the fast track, and then he may have premature death due to metabolic or microvascular complication like renal failure. Pathogenesis of the natural history of type 2 diabetes, it is undiagnosed and remains asymptomatic. Now, even if diagnosis is made early, patient undergoes a screening test and diagnosis is made early. Now, it is believed that actual pathophysiological abnormalities which cause this dysglycemia, they were there at least for 10 years. That means that even before the diagnosis is made, one is more prone to develop macrovascular complication before the diagnosis is made. So in type 2 diabetes, it is never too early to start doing something. First 10 years, patient is minimally symptomatic, whether patient is taking treatment or not taking treatment. I'm not saying that the treatment is not important, but even if patient is not taking treatment, patient is likely to remain asymptomatic, and sometimes patients use that excuse for not taking medication. But after this 10 years, they develop complication and then various problems like macrovascular, somebody develop ischemic heart disease, somebody would develop visual problem, other would develop renal failure, other would develop gangrene, another would develop stroke. So number of problems. In type 2 diabetes, it is extremely important to take an early action and focus on glucose as well as all other factors which I just mentioned. So thank you very much for this. Was an introduction of diabetes. I covered the homeostasis of glucose and I covered the definition of the various types of diabetes. I gave you the classification and I gave you the criteria for the diagnosis, and I also gave you brief account about the complications, the metabolic complication, microvascular complication, macrovascular complication. I also briefly tried to explain how these complications develop. And the message is that it is never enough to do something for type 2 diabetic patient, because despite treatment they tend to develop complication. Of course, that does not mean that there is no benefit of treatment. Treatment will reduce the chances of complication. They may be prevented or they may be delayed. So I'm going to stop here, but we will continue next time. We will continue for about 6-7 lectures on diabetes. So I will be looking forward to see you in my next presentation on diabetes. Thank you very much. This is Professor Azizur Rahman from Medurstand-Understanding Medicine.